The Rocky Creed franchise is host to some of the most iconic adversaries put to film, and with the latest addition to that dynasty being introduced in Creed 3, I see it fit to compare him to the boxers of old to determine who would win in an all-out boxing match. Both Clubber Lang and Damian spent time behind bars, were each the villains of threequels, and with many theorizing or maybe even expecting some type of Lang representation in Creed 3 before its release, I think this matchup is more than appropriate. So, let's begin this breakdown and see who would actually win. Starting off with the more senior fighter, as seen in Rocky 3, let's look at the power, speed, fighting style, and tenacity of Clubber Lang. Having been abandoned by his family at a young age, Clubber would stalk the mean streets of Chicago. Lang would see himself in and out of juvie and eventually prison, hardening his resolve and leading him to channel his rage through the sport of boxing. He'd settle many big house brawls in the ring, eventually being set free, seeking to make a name as a pro. He'd work his way up the ranks, defeating many acclaimed fighters such as Vietnam veterans, and even those confident enough themselves to chase after the great Apollo Creed's ranking. Many bouts ended with Clubber getting the KO, as the Southside Slugger's power charted him a path to becoming the #1 heavyweight contender, crossing paths with Rocky Balboa. While shaken and unconfident as his trainer Mickey lay succumbing to a heart attack, Clubber would brutally embarrass Balboa within a few short rounds, earning the title from a less than 100% there Rocky. Admittedly, this isn't such an impressive victory as it might look, only because of Rocky's own shaken state even before the fight started. A boxer's mentality and confidence is arguably half the battle after all. Regardless, Apollo Creed, known by many as the greatest of all time, saw it necessary to train Balboa like never before, boosting the Italian stallion's prowess to heights yet unseen, all in order to contend with Lang. In fact, it's been stated that if not for Creed's training, Rocky still would not have come out on top, possibly meaning that, say, Rocky from the time of the second super fight against Apollo still wouldn't be enough to best Clubber despite his confidence at that time. Balboa's new skills and training were 100% imperative in beating Clubber. This is as well backed up by statements referring to Lang as the most dangerous fighter Rocky had ever encountered up to that point, both from inside the film itself as well as in official summaries and descriptions of Rocky 3, meaning Clubber is an overall greater fighter or bigger threat in a fight than either Apollo seen in Rocky 1 and 2. Even Apollo says as much before getting back his own Eye of the Tiger. This is insanely impressive for many reasons. Of course, Apollo was described as a perfect fighter, the fastest hands of his era, one of the most skilled combatants, all this at the time of Rocky 1 and 2, and Clubber, through his raw power and fighting style, proves a bigger threat overall to Rocky Balboa. In fact, as seen in the officially licensed Creed Champions video game, Clubber even outright beat this Apollo prior to his own training alongside Balboa in a boxing match. Creed here should at the very least be similar to his Rocky 1 era self, as he was retired by Rocky 3 and as well took his training very lightly in Rocky 1, so Clubber objectively performs better than Balboa did in the first super fight, taking the outright victory against Apollo, not just going the distance. This video game is again officially backed by MGM, the film studio owning the franchise, and exists to expand the lore of the movies. Michael B. Jordan, who is now an acting director and producer of the films, even portrays his character in the game, with the VR version of Rumble Boxing still receiving updates alongside the release of Creed 3. Despite this feat, however, against the beast Rocky had become later, forged by his old rival's training, Clubber himself was now put to shame in his rematch with Balboa, a fight that likely would have ended even sooner if not for Balboa's need to prove himself to himself. I explained this as well in my prior video, but it's well observed that Rocky would many times go out of his way to take his opponent's hits, as to break their spirits and to ensure that he could take the punishment and keep moving forward. If not for that, Clubber would not have even made it to round 3 in all likelihood. After the events of Rocky 4, we even see Clubber take on Ivan Drago, the strongest and most well-trained foe in the entire franchise, before succumbing to his hate-fueled assault, being sent into critical condition. In terms of striking power, durability, endurance, the safest place to put Clubber is squarely above the likes of Rocky 1 and 2 fighters. His stamina and longevity is of course in question, likely offset by his crushing punching power, as he's more often than not seen getting the KO fairly early on rather than going the distance into later rounds. This was in fact observed by Apollo Creed in Rocky's training, that Clubber could likely be gassed out. As far as his technique and prowess, again, he should be greater than that of the Master of Disaster and the Italian Stallion as they were in the first 2 Rocky films. Apollo's opinion and the more definitive statements declaring Clubber as the most powerful adversary Balboa's ever seen would likely mean he could hang in there with Apollo long enough that his power would carry him into some type of victory. If all Clubber was a wrecking machine, he'd be too slow and clumsy to do much damage. However, evidently, his swiftness and prowess are considerable enough in tandem with his striking force to put him above those greats as they were in Rocky 1 and 2, again stated multiple times over. His fighting style more specifically consists of a nearly perfect application of devastating power, no matter the combination. He's as well a ruthless fighter, lacking respect or sportsmanship, settling for nothing less than a total knockout. He's conditioned to play by the rules, but he will bend them if he sees it fit. Fighters with mighty KO power, and even the most skilled in their countries, were not enough for Clubber Lang. And to mention it again, surviving a fight for a time against the likes of Ivan Drago is no small feat, the Russian being a perfectly trained fighter, sporting up to 2,150 pounds per square inch behind his strikes. Nearly 1.5 times more energy than Mike Tyson's punches, more than 4 times the force to shatter a real-world human skull and even concrete. Clubber would have had to keep up with Ivan and endure some measure of his bone-crushing attacks before eventually falling to the downright bloodlusted Drago. Ivan in this fight projecting all of his hatred of Balboa onto Clubber Lang during their fight. Damian Diamond Dame Anderson shares a very similar upbringing as his opponent, also serving time in juvenile centers and prison. Damian does stand out, however, insofar as his boxing career starting much sooner and to more acclaim, reigning as the local Golden Gloves champion before serving out an 18-year sentence. Eventually returning to the streets, Anderson too hungered for the title and began enacting a years-long plan in the making. Illegally injuring the then #1 heavyweight fighter during a spar, Damian would enact dirty fighting upon the intentionally worse for wear Felix Chavez, breaking many rules in the form of elbows, kicks, and more, all to illegitimately steal the title of heavyweight champion of the world. This would force his longtime friend and former champion Adonis Creed out of a years-long retirement to do battle. Adonis, with his career-earned injuries placing him past his prime, would nonetheless train like he had been taught to before. Their fight was intense. Blocks, punches, and counterpunches flew as the two seemed evenly matched. However, Duke Jr., Adonis's coach, called out the fighter for holding back on his old friend and even reminded the Creed to let go of his guilt into the later rounds of their fight. Mentally, for the most part, Creed wasn't all in on besting Damian, despite eventually doing so. Proven to be an illegitimate champion, we can only hope Anderson's loss inspires him to be better and maybe one day earn the title fair and square, like he always dreamed of doing. Damian as a boxer is mostly a defensive one with strong footwork, as well incorporating powerful jabs and hooks, and is an expert at closing the distance and weaving his way back out. Again though, his title was gained through nefarious and unapproved means that miraculously went unnoticed by the referee. Damian had to have paid these guys off. So, with both fighters' accolades and abilities presented, who between these two tertiary foes would come out on top? Starting with power, that being striking and endurance, Clubber surpasses the likes of Rocky and Apollo from Rocky 1 and 2, as stated. Both legendary fighters based on their respective skill and willpower. However, Adonis was stated by Sylvester Stallone on Twitter to be capable of easily defeating Clubber within 3 rounds via sheer strength and speed. And Sly not only wrote every Rocky film, directed the bulk of them, but was even credited as a writer for Creed 2, the film released around the time this statement was made. He even continues to produce the series, albeit from afar, so his word carries a lot of weight. So, case closed, right? Adonis is too strong and fast for Clubber. Damian traded blows with Adonis for up to 12 rounds, only losing towards the end. That's all she wrote. Well, like I alluded to earlier, we know for a fact that Adonis wasn't giving it his all against Damian in the earlier rounds and still harbored regret towards the closing moments of the battle.
I need you to let go of your fear. Let go of the guilt. Let go of whatever was and walk into what is.
On top of the fact that Adonis by the time of Creed 3 was described as old and broken compared to his past self by Duke Jr. Those weaknesses were made strengths, sure, but based on similar methods employed by Duke Sr. when faced with debilitated fighters, bolstering their striking power is the safest bet to keep them relevant when they pass their prime. Yet, at the same time, no one's going to argue that Rocky 6 or even Rocky 5 Rocky, who's more so close to Adonis's age in Creed 3, are either of the characters' primes. As demonstrated in my Rocky vs. Adonis video, Ivan Drago stands as a foe more powerful and durable than any other seen in Rocky or Creed, and Clubber was able to contend with him for some time. Ivan was outright trying to murder Clubber when he lost, likely angrier and more passionate than he had ever been, seeing as this was after his loss to Rocky in Rocky 4. And Lang stood in there for a time, despite Ivan literally projecting Balboa onto Clubber in their fight. Not to mention Damian's nature as a far dirtier fighter than even Clubber Lang. Clubber took cheap shots, but he always remained in the world of boxing, no kicks or elbows. This combined with the fact that Anderson's described as more of a brawler than a necessarily skilled boxer.
For Damian Anderson in this one, we pulled a lot from Bernard Hopkins, Joe Frazier, more brawlers than boxers a little bit.
And the fact that it was an out of prime and likely holding back, or at least somewhat conflicted Adonis that put Dame away, I'd have to side with Clubber on this one, just barely. Damian is described as Adonis's greatest opponent. However, this is likely due to the fact that he is his most personal foe thus far and knows Adonis better than anyone he's fought up to this point. He is clearly an incredibly powerful fighter, but a good metric to use here would be Victor Drago. Felix Chavez, a pupil of Adonis, was told that he wasn't yet ready to fight Victor as scheduled, and yet Damian felt it necessary to use underhanded tactics to beat Felix rather than simply outboxing him legitimately, meaning that Victor is likely as well simply a better, or at least more powerful fighter by the time of Creed 3 than Damian as well. And again, referring to my prior video, the Junior Drago simply does not have enough to place him within the roided up, skull-crushing 4 times over power of his superhuman father. Said Ivan Drago, being someone Clubber could contend with for a time, while the former was greatly enraged. In a legitimate boxing match, I see Clubber as the more skilled and powerful opponent, being a near-perfect fighter compared to more of a cheating brawler in Damian's case, and being in the same ballpark roughly as an enraged Ivan Drago compared to Anderson being demonstrably out of Victor Drago's league. I think if Damian were to try any of his underhanded tactics against Lang after his berating of the ref, the Southside slugger's lack of respect and a conscience would be inflamed, holding nothing back as he applies constant pressure and lightness of feet to eventually send Damian to the mat after a series of powerful strikes to the body and head. Be sure to let me know your thoughts or suggestions for future matchups in the comments down below. Subscribe to my Patreon to join my Discord server and speak to me directly. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.